On August 20, 1940, a single blow changed the course of history. Leon Trotsky, the once powerful revolutionary, was attacked in his exile home in Mexico by a Soviet agent. The weapon? An ice axe. The result? His violent, brutal end. But how did a man who had once shaped the fate of nations meet such a tragic demise? The clock was ticking, and Trotsky had only hours left to live. Leon Trotsky was one of the most influential figures in the Russian Revolution. A key architect of the Bolshevik movement, Trotsky's role in the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the establishment of Soviet Russia was undeniable. He wasn't just the leader, he was a visionary, a man who believed in the power of the people to shape their own destiny. A brilliant orator and tactician, Trotsky's influence spread far beyond Russia, inspiring socialists and revolutionaries around the world. Born in 1779 in Yanovka, Ukraine, Trotsky was a child of privilege, but quickly became involved in the revolutionary cause. As a young man, he joined the Marxist movement, leading to his eventual rise within the Bolshevik Party. His greatest contribution was in the Red Army, where his leadership during the Russian Civil War helped secure the Bolsheviks' victory. It was under his command that the Red Army became a formidable fighting force, securing the future of the Soviet regime. Trotsky's brilliance was not limited to military strategy. He was a key figure in Marxist theory and the creation of the Fourth International, a body dedicated to promoting Trotsky's interpretation of Marxism. Trotsky's beliefs put him at odds with other Soviet leaders, especially Joseph Stalin. The relationship between Trotsky and Stalin grew increasingly bitter, with Stalin's ruthless methods contrasting with Trotsky's more idealistic vision for the future of the Soviet Union. Despite Trotsky's immense popularity within the revolution, his ideological differences with Stalin marked the beginning of his downfall. As Stalin consolidated power, Trotsky found himself increasingly marginalized. By the time Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929, he had already become Stalin's greatest rival. The Great Purge of the late 1930s, in which Stalin sought to eliminate all opposition, left Trotsky's supporters in constant danger, and Trotsky himself had no choice but to seek exile in Turkey. But even in exile, Trotsky's voice remained a powerful symbol of resistance to Stalin's tyranny. And while Trotsky had left the Soviet Union, Stalin's long arm of repression continued to follow him. Trotsky's fight against Stalin's regime was far from over. Though exiled, Trotsky's life was still in grave danger. But little did he know, the final confrontation was approaching, and this time there would be no escape. After being expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929, Leon Trotsky found himself a man without a country. His ideas and influence were still strong, but the Soviet regime had made it clear Trotsky was an enemy who needed to be silenced. His exile took him to various countries, including Turkey, France, and Norway, where he continued to write, speak, and criticize Stalin's regime from afar. But despite his outward confidence and resolve, Trotsky's life was now one of constant vulnerability. Trotsky's years in exile were marked by his continued opposition to Stalin's rule. He wrote extensively, challenging Stalin's interpretation of Marxism and warning the world about the authoritarianism taking hold in the Soviet Union. His most notable work, The Revolution Betrayed, highlighted his belief that Stalin had corrupted the ideals of the October Revolution. This book became a powerful tool for Trotskyists across the world, but it also made Trotsky a target. Despite living in different countries, Trotsky was never truly free. The long reach of Stalin's regime meant that Trotsky was never safe. He lived with the constant threat of assassination. In fact, Stalin had ordered Trotsky's death long before the final assassination attempt in 1940. Over the years, Trotskyists and other sympathizers were rounded up and executed by Stalin's secret police, the NKVD.
The repression that Trotsky had warned about in his writings was taking shape around him, and he knew that he would likely never return to the Soviet Union alive. In 1937, Trotsky was granted asylum in Mexico by the Mexican government. There, he would settle into a new life with his second wife, Natalia Sedova, and their children. His house in Coyoacán, Mexico, became a symbolic fortress of Trotskyist thought. Trotsky continued to write, speak, and organize the Fourth International, which sought to spread his version of Marxism worldwide. But despite his public and political activity, Trotsky was becoming increasingly isolated. The Stalinist regime's efforts to destroy Trotskyism went beyond mere ideological debate. The Soviet government used every means at their disposal to attack Trotsky personally. His life was in constant danger, but he remained resolute. Trotsky may have been far from Russia, but Stalin's death squads were still tracking his every move. His fight was no longer just against Stalin's policies, but against an enemy that would stop at nothing to silence him. Would Trotsky remain free to challenge Stalin, or was the clock ticking toward his inevitable fate? By the summer of 1940, Leon Trotsky had been living in Mexico for nearly 3 years, surrounded by a tight-knit group of loyalists. But even in his sanctuary, he was never truly safe. The long arm of Stalin's NKVD had been relentless, and Trotsky knew that his days were numbered. Little did he know that the very people he trusted were now part of the Soviet plot to end his life. The man tasked with carrying out Trotsky's assassination was Ramón Mercader, a Spanish communist and undercover agent working for the NKVD. Mercader had been carefully groomed for this mission by Soviet intelligence, and he had spent months infiltrating Trotsky's inner circle. To get close to Trotsky, Mercader didn't rely on brute force. He was subtle and patient. Mercader posed as an ally of Trotsky's, a fellow Trotskyist who shared his views on the Soviet regime. He even romantically engaged with Sylvia Agiloff, Trotsky's personal secretary, to gain access to Trotsky's home. While Mercader's relationship with Agiloff appeared to be a genuine love affair, it was merely a means to an end. He had one objective: to assassinate Trotsky and eliminate the last significant threat to Stalin's control over the Soviet Union. In the months leading up to the assassination, Mercader had been carefully orchestrating the perfect opportunity. Trotsky, surrounded by his loyal supporters, remained vigilant but was unaware that Mercader had been sent to kill him. Mercader was methodical in his approach, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His chance came on August 20th, 1940, when he managed to secure a meeting with Trotsky under the pretense of discussing a manuscript for publication. That day, Trotsky was in his study, working on his latest writings, unaware that Mercader was preparing to make his move. Mercader had spent months gaining Trotsky's trust, but now, as the moment of truth approached, one question remained. Would his carefully laid plan succeed, or would Trotsky be able to survive the deadly encounter? On August 20th, 1940, the attack that would claim the life of one of the most influential figures of the Russian Revolution finally unfolded. Trotsky was in his study in his residence in Coyoacán, Mexico, sitting at his desk, surrounded by his writings and revolutionary thoughts. The house, heavily guarded by loyalists, seemed like a safe haven, but Trotsky's refuge had been infiltrated, and that day his fate would take a brutal turn. Ramón Mercader, disguised as a friend and ally, entered Trotsky's study under the guise of discussing a manuscript that was to be published. He was carrying a mountaineering ice axe concealed under his clothing. Mercader, with a calm demeanor, approached Trotsky and began discussing the manuscript. But his mind was on the violent task he had been sent to complete. As Trotsky leaned over his desk, Mercader suddenly pulled out the ice axe and struck him in the skull with a force that fractured Trotsky's parietal bone and penetrated his brain. Trotsky's reaction was swift and defiant. Despite the excruciating pain, he managed to spit in Mercader's face, a final act of resistance. As Mercader attempted to strike again, Trotsky's bodyguards, who had been alert to any threat, sprang into action. A violent struggle ensued. Trotsky, despite his injury, was able to break Mercader's hand before the assassin was subdued. However, The damage had already been done. The blow to Trotsky's head was severe. Mercader, still grasping the ice axe, was quickly overpowered and restrained by Trotsky's guards, but the revolutionary leader had been left bleeding, with serious head trauma. The gravity of the situation became clear almost immediately. The attempt on Trotsky's life was not just a political attack, it was a personal vendetta orchestrated by Stalin, the very man Trotsky had once called his comrade. Trotsky was rushed to the hospital immediately. The operation was risky and uncertain, but doctors did their best to save him. The wound, however, was too severe. The damage to his brain was extensive, and despite the efforts to stabilize him, Trotsky's survival was highly unlikely.
Trotsky had survived the first strike, but the question remained, could he survive long enough to exact his own revenge? Or had this brutal attack sealed his fate? His fate now hung in the balance, and the world awaited the outcome. Leon Trotsky's wife now hung by a thread. As he was rushed to the hospital, the full extent of the attack began to reveal itself. The ice axe had fractured his skull, and the brain injury was so severe that it left little hope for survival. However, despite the overwhelming odds, Trotsky remained conscious for a brief period, his mind sharp, even as his body faltered. He reportedly spat at his assassin, Ramon Mercader, a defiant gesture in the face of death. Trotsky's bodyguards quickly subdued Mercader, but the damage was already done. As Mercader was arrested by Mexican authorities, Trotsky was whisked away for emergency surgery. Doctors worked furiously to stem the bleeding, but the injury to his brain was irreparable. For hours, Trotsky remained in critical condition, slipping in and out of consciousness, but he never lost his resolve. He was a man who had survived years of political exile, numerous attempts on his life, and yet it seemed that it was his own comrade's betrayal that would finally claim him. The next 24 hours would be agonizing. Trotsky's body, weakened by shock and blood loss, began to fail. His wife, Natalia Sedova, and closest confidants stayed by his side, holding out hope against the seemingly inevitable. For a while, it appeared as though Trotsky might defy the odds, just as he had done so many times before. But by August 21, 1940, the struggle was over. Trotsky, the man who had shaped revolutions and led the Red Army to victory, was dead. News of Trotsky's death quickly spread around the world, though it was met with mixed reactions. Some saw his assassination as a victory for Stalin and the Soviet regime, a political rival eliminated at long last. But for many others, Trotsky's death marked the end of an era. The Russian Revolution, once an inspiring force for millions, now seemed tainted by the cruelty of Stalin's methods. Trotsky's assassination, although meticulously planned, had left behind a legacy that Stalin could never fully erase. Despite the bloodshed, Trotsky's ideological battle continued. His followers, the Trotskyists, now had a martyr to rally around. His death cemented his place in history as a symbol of defiance against Stalin's regime, and for some, it was the last act of a man who had devoted his life to the revolution. Trotsky was dead, but the story didn't end with his death. His legacy, his vision of the revolution, would continue to inspire new generations. Was his death the end of the Trotskyist movement, or would it become the rallying cry for resistance around the world? After the attack, Ramon Mercader was quickly arrested by the Mexican authorities. His mission, carefully planned and executed by Stalin's agents, had been successful, but his capture was inevitable. The assassination of Leon Trotsky was a political act that not only eliminated a key rival to Stalin's leadership, but also marked the final chapter in the Soviet leader's brutal campaign to rid himself of all opposition. Mercader, a Soviet agent, had been infiltrating Trotsky's inner circle for months. Posing as a fellow Trotskyist, Mercader had managed to gain Trotsky's trust. He was romantically involved with Sylvia Agaloff, Trotsky's secretary, which further solidified his position in Trotsky's household. His patience was part of his plan. He waited for the perfect moment to strike. Once arrested, Mercader was put on trial in Mexico. In court, he showed little remorse, repeating that he had been carrying out a mission for the Soviet government. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison for the murder of Trotsky, but even behind bars, he remained a tool of Soviet influence. In 1960, after serving just over 20 years in prison, Mercader was released from prison and returned to the Soviet Union as a hero. He was awarded the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star, honors given to him for his role in the assassination of Trotsky. Mercader's legacy as Trotsky's killer is intertwined with the long history of Soviet political repression. His act of assassination was not just the killing of one man, it was part of a larger effort to silence any threat to Stalin's rule. For many, Mercader became the face of Stalin's purges, a loyal servant who was willing to kill for the cause of Soviet communism. Despite Mercader's role in Trotsky's death, it was clear that Stalin had won a temporary victory. But Trotsky's ideas, written in his numerous works and propagated through his followers, did not die with him. Mercader may have silenced one voice, but the Trotskyist movement and the ideals of permanent revolution would live on in the hearts of many revolutionaries around the world. Mercader had executed his mission, but Trotsky's death didn't mark the end of his movement. Would the ideas he died for continue to inspire resistance, or was Stalin's victory truly complete? The battle was over, but the war of ideas was just beginning.
The assassination of Leon Trotsky in 1940 may have silenced his physical presence, but it was far from the end of his revolutionary ideas. Despite Stalin's relentless efforts to eliminate his political rivals, Trotsky's legacy lived on in the hearts of his followers and in the global movement he had helped inspire. His vision of socialism, his belief in permanent revolution, and his critique of the Stalinist regime continued to resonate with many, even after his death. In the years following Trotsky's assassination, his ideological battle continued, especially through the Fourth International, the organization he had founded to oppose Stalinist authoritarianism. Though weakened by Trotsky's death, the Trotskyist movement persisted, with various factions rallying around his ideas. The followers of Trotsky continued to argue for a true Marxist revolution, one that would transcend the bureaucratic and totalitarian system that Stalin had created in the Soviet Union. But it was not just political groups that kept Trotsky's ideas alive. His writings, particularly his works on permanent revolution, internationalism, and his critiques of Stalin's policies, remained highly influential. These texts became sacred texts for left-wing intellectuals, activists, and revolutionaries around the world. Trotsky's sharp critiques of Stalin's betrayal of the revolution provided a blueprint for understanding the corruption of the Soviet state and the repression that would come to define Stalinist rule. Trotsky's followers, though often persecuted and marginalized, continued to challenge Stalinist orthodoxy, striving to keep his revolutionary flame alive. The Trotskyist movement splintered into many factions, some more radical, others more moderate, but they were united by their dedication to Trotsky's vision of international revolution and the defeat of Stalinism. In the West, Trotsky's ideas found a place among intellectuals and left-wing activists who saw in him the potential for a more democratic socialism. But Trotskyism remained a controversial ideology, often seen as an extremist or utopian movement by many. Despite the ongoing persecution, his followers believed that Trotsky's ideas were not just relevant, but necessary for understanding and challenging the evolving world order. Trotsky's death had not extinguished his ideas, it had only given them a martyr. As the world struggled with the aftermath of World War II and the rise of Cold War tensions, the question remained, could Trotsky's vision of revolution ever be realized in the face of Stalin's enduring legacy? The death of Leon Trotsky on August 21, 1940, was not only a significant loss for the revolutionary movement, but also a major victory for Joseph Stalin. Stalin's long-standing rivalry with Trotsky had led to a series of political purges and brutal repressions within the Soviet Union, culminating in Trotsky's exile and eventual assassination. Stalin's ultimate goal was to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his control over the Soviet state, and Trotsky, once a key player in the Bolshevik Revolution, had been one of his most formidable opponents. Trotsky's death brought closure to Stalin's vendetta against the man who had once been his comrade in arms. The assassination of Trotsky in Mexico was a strategic move to end the ideological battle between Stalin's form of socialism and Trotsky's vision of permanent revolution. For Stalin, the execution of Trotsky was a symbolic act that eliminated his most ruthless critic, whose writings and actions continued to challenge the Soviet status quo. However, Stalin's victory was far from complete. Despite Trotsky's physical death, his ideological challenge was far from over. The Trotskyist movement continued to exist, and Trotsky's followers continued to spread his ideas globally. Stalin's victory in silencing Trotsky did not mean he could completely extinguish the revolutionary spirit that Trotsky had inspired. Moreover, the assassination revealed the brutality of Stalin's leadership. Trotsky's death highlighted the authoritarian nature of Stalin's regime and the lengths to which he would go to consolidate power. The Soviet Union had become a totalitarian state, where opposition was not just silenced, but erased. The world watched as Trotsky, the last remaining figure of the revolution's original leadership, was cut down in such a violent and secretive manner. Despite this, the death of Trotsky did not bring Stalin the peace he sought. His methods of control through fear and repression would eventually lead to the fallout of his regime. Stalin may have eliminated Trotsky, but the larger problem of Soviet repression and the corruption of the revolution remained an issue that would haunt Soviet society for decades to come. Though Stalin had succeeded in silencing Trotsky, the deeper question remained: could Stalin's hold on the Soviet Union endure? Or was his victory only a temporary reprieve from the inevitable cracks in his totalitarian regime?
The assassination of Leon Trotsky reverberated far beyond the borders of Mexico and the Soviet Union. His death, orchestrated by Stalin's agents, sent shockwaves through political movements and revolutionary circles worldwide. For many, Trotsky's violent end symbolized the dark and unforgiving nature of Stalinist repression, and his assassination became a rallying cry for those still holding on to his revolutionary ideas. But the global reaction to his death was not just one of mourning. It was a reflection of the political and ideological divide that had shaped the 20th century. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's regime portrayed Trotsky's assassination as a necessary act to rid the world of a counter-revolutionary who had sought to undermine the revolution Stalin had built. The official Soviet narrative painted Trotsky as a traitor, a man who had betrayed the socialist cause, and his death was positioned as a justified blow to his heretical ideas. State-controlled media celebrated his death as a triumph over enemies of the revolution. For Stalin, this was the culmination of a long-standing campaign to eliminate any potential challenges to his absolute power. However, outside the Soviet Union, Trotsky's death was met with a vastly different response. In the West, many intellectuals, writers, and socialists viewed Trotsky as the true heir to Lenin's legacy. To them, Trotsky's death was a tragic loss of a revolutionary who had challenged imperialism, advocated for global socialism, and fought for genuine Marxist principles. Some of the most prominent left-wing figures, such as Jean-Paul Sartre and André Gide, expressed their shock and sorrow at his assassination. His murder reinforced the idea that Stalin's Soviet Union was not a beacon of revolutionary hope, but a brutal dictatorial regime that had betrayed the ideals of the October Revolution. Trotsky's followers, particularly those aligned with the Fourth International, were devastated by the loss of their leader. However, his death galvanized them to continue his ideological fight against Stalin's totalitarian rule. Trotskyism would live on through his writings, and his followers would dedicate themselves to preserving his vision of international revolution and permanent revolution. Despite the assassination, Trotsky's intellectual and political influence persisted, inspiring future generations of revolutionaries. Yet the reaction wasn't one-sided. Some saw Trotsky's death as the necessary end to an era of chaos and division within socialist movements. His assassination cleared the way for Stalin's dominance in Soviet communism, securing his control and silencing his most vocal critic. But while Stalin may have thought Trotsky's death was the final blow to his opposition, the global reaction revealed just how deep the ideological rift ran, and how Trotsky's legacy would continue to affect revolutionary movements for years to come. Trotsky's death had sparked a global reaction, but did it mark the end of Trotskyism, or would the movement survive in the shadows? As the world shifted, the question remained, would Trotsky's vision live on, or was it destined to be erased by Stalin's control? Leon Trotsky's assassination marked the tragic end of one of the most profound and contentious chapters in the history of the Russian Revolution. In the years that followed, his death became both a symbol of Stalin's brutal rise to power and a poignant reminder of the unresolved struggles within the socialist movement. The revolution that Trotsky had helped lead, one that had promised a new world of equality and freedom, had been co-opted by a dictatorship that stood in direct opposition to those ideals. Stalin's victory in silencing Trotsky was seen as the final consolidation of Soviet totalitarianism. But for many, it was far from a decisive conclusion. Trotsky's legacy lived on not in his immediate followers or the Soviet Union, but in the global impact his ideas would continue to have on socialist and revolutionary movements around the world. The Fourth International, which Trotsky had founded, continued its mission despite the loss of its leader, and Trotskyism, although marginalized, remained a force for those who resisted Stalin's orthodoxy. His writings, particularly on permanent revolution and the nature of the Soviet state, would inspire countless activists and intellectuals who viewed the Soviet Union's corruption as a betrayal of the true revolutionary spirit. In the broader scope of world history, Trotsky's assassination served as a turning point. The global socialist movement became increasingly divided between the forces of Stalinism and the Trotskyist alternative. The ideological battle Trotsky had waged did not end with his death, but continued to play out in the political turmoil of the 20th century. The collapse of the Soviet Union decades later proved that Stalin's revolutionary legacy was not as permanent as he had believed. In the end, Trotsky's warnings about the dangers of bureaucratic totalitarianism in the socialist movement were vindicated. Despite the tragic nature of Trotsky's final hours, the brutal attack, the betrayal by a trusted ally, and the personal loss for his family, his death was not the end. Instead, it marked the start of a new chapter in the battle for his revolutionary ideals. The death of Trotsky, like that of many historical figures, became the catalyst for the continuation of his ideas. Trotsky's voice may have been silenced, but the fight for a better world he had envisioned would never die. As the Soviet Union moved forward under Stalin's iron grip, Trotsky's death seemed to mark the end of an era, but in the shadows, his ideas were far from forgotten. In the years to come, would Trotsky's vision of revolution rise again to challenge the world order, or was it a legacy destined to remain unfulfilled?